What if I told you that a simple building design revolutionized not just how Americans travel, but how businesses think about customer experience, standardization, and the relationship between space and freedom? That a rectangular building with a neon sign didn't just provide places to sleep, but fundamentally reshaped American culture, economics, and even our conception of privacy and mobility. The 1950s Roadside Motel wasn't just accommodation. It was a complete reinvention of hospitality, a radical business model that democratized travel, and a cultural phenomenon that expressed post-war America's deepest values about independence, family, and the open road. These weren't hotels that happened to be near highways. These were entirely new institutions designed from scratch for the automobile age, and they changed everything. Before we dive into how a simple business idea became a cultural revolution, hit that like button if you're ready to understand the psychology of design, the economics of standardization, and the sociology of American mobility. Subscribe for deep dives into how architecture shapes behavior and business models create culture. And comment, what aspect of motel culture do you think most influenced modern hospitality? The standardization, the privacy, the accessibility. Because for the next 70 minutes, we're analyzing the motel phenomenon from angles you've never considered. We're going to understand why the motel business model was revolutionary, how design choices reflected cultural values, why standardization became America's greatest export, and what the rise and fall of the classic motel teaches us about innovation, obsolescence, and nostalgia. This isn't nostalgia. This is business history, cultural analysis, and design psychology, all converging on one of the most underappreciated innovations in American commercial architecture. Get comfortable, because the story of the roadside motel is really the story of how America figured out how to sell freedom. Part 1. The Business Revolution: How Motels Invented Modern Hospitality Economics. The problem traditional hotels couldn't solve. To understand why motels emerged as a revolutionary business model, you need to understand the specific economic problem they solved. Before World War II, the American hospitality industry operated on a fundamentally urban model. Hotels were designed for trained travelers. They were located in city centers near train stations. They were vertical buildings with lobbies, elevators, bellhops, and all the infrastructure of traditional European hospitality transplanted to American cities. This model had massive problems for the emerging automobile traveler. First, the economics didn't work. Downtown real estate was expensive. Building vertically required expensive construction, elevators, complex plumbing systems, and large staffs. All these costs had to be passed on to customers through high room rates. Second, the location was wrong. Automobile travelers didn't want to drive into congested city centers. They wanted to stay on the highway to make the journey itself efficient. Third, the service model was misaligned. The traditional hotel emphasized personal service, social interaction in lobbies, formal dining. But automobile travelers wanted speed, privacy, and convenience. The motel business model solved all these problems simultaneously through radical innovation in location, architecture, and service delivery. Let's break down each revolutionary element. The economics of land arbitrage. The first breakthrough was recognizing that location could be an economic advantage rather than an aesthetic choice. Traditional hotels needed expensive downtown locations because they depended on foot traffic and proximity to train stations. But motels could succeed on cheap highway land precisely because their customers arrived by car. This was economic arbitrage at its finest. Take land that's worthless for traditional commercial development because it's too far from the urban core, and make it valuable by serving customers who specifically want to avoid urban cores. This land arbitrage created extraordinary profit margins. A motel owner could purchase an acre of highway land for a fraction of what downtown hotel land cost, build a simple single-story structure for far less than a multi-story hotel, and still charge competitive rates because they offered something hotels couldn't provide: convenience for drivers. The economics were transformative. Small entrepreneurs could enter the hospitality business with relatively modest capital investment, something impossible in the traditional hotel industry, dominated by large corporations and wealthy families. The architectural innovation of horizontal design. The second revolutionary element was architectural. Motels went horizontal instead of vertical, and this wasn't just about construction costs. This was a fundamental reimagining of what hospitality space should be. Traditional hotels were vertical because urban land was scarce and expensive. You built up because you couldn't build out. But on highway land, space was plentiful and cheap. Building horizontally eliminated the need for elevators, complex plumbing systems, and the structural engineering required for tall buildings. But the genius went deeper. Horizontal design with exterior access created a completely different guest experience. In a hotel, you park in a garage or lot, walk through a lobby where staff and other guests see you, take an elevator, walk down interior corridors. It's social, public, surveilled. The motel inverted this. You drive directly to your room, park right outside your door, and enter with maximum privacy. Nobody sees you check in. Nobody sees what you carry into your room. Nobody sees when you leave or when you return. This design choice reflected and shaped American cultural values in profound ways. It prioritized privacy over social interaction, individual autonomy over communal experience, efficiency over ceremony. The motel room became a private space in a way hotel rooms never were. This privacy had obvious practical benefits for families, for business travelers who arrived late and left early, for anyone who valued discretion. But it also reflected broader cultural shifts in post-war America toward individualism, privacy, and the separation of public and private life. The service model revolution. The third innovation was eliminating most traditional hotel services. In a hotel, you needed bellhops to carry luggage because guests were parking far from their rooms. You needed elevators and elevator operators. You needed room service because guests were far from their cars and from restaurants. You needed elaborate lobbies because guests spent time in them. You needed large staffs because the building and service model were labor-intensive. Motels eliminated all this. No bellhops because you parked outside your room. No elevator operators because there were no elevators. No room service because you could drive to restaurants. No elaborate lobbies because guests went straight to their rooms. This reduction in services wasn't cheapness. It was aligning service delivery with what customers actually wanted. Automobile travelers didn't want someone to carry their bags. They wanted to unload their car and get to their room quickly. They didn't want to dress up for dining rooms. They wanted to eat at highway diners in casual clothes. This service reduction had revolutionary economic implications. A motel could operate with minimal staff, often just a manager who lived on site and handled check-ins, plus a small housekeeping crew. Labor costs plummeted compared to hotels. This meant motels could charge prices accessible to middle-class families while still maintaining healthy profit margins. The democratization of travel wasn't about charity. It was about a business model that made accessibility profitable. The innovation of standardization. Perhaps the most revolutionary business innovation was standardization. Hotel chains existed before motels, but motel chains took standardization to an entirely new level. Every room in every location was essentially identical. Same layout, same furniture, same amenities, same bedding. This sounds boring, but it was brilliant business psychology. Think about the decision-making process of a traveler arriving in an unfamiliar town late at night, exhausted from driving. They see multiple motel signs. How do they choose? With independent motels, every choice is a gamble. You have no idea what you're getting until you walk in and see the room. But with a chain motel, you know exactly what you're getting because you've stayed in their rooms before, or you've heard about them, or you've seen their advertising. This predictability dramatically reduces the psychological cost of decision-making. Standardization also created powerful economies of scale. Motel chains could negotiate bulk purchases of everything from towels to televisions to soap. They could develop standardized construction methods that reduced building costs. They could create training programs that made any employee interchangeable. They could advertise nationally because the product was identical everywhere. These economies of scale made chain motels even more profitable than independent ones, driving consolidation and the rise of major brands like Holiday Inn, Ramada, and Best Western. The franchise model revolution. The motel industry pioneered and perfected the franchise model that would later be applied to fast food, retail, and countless other industries. Holiday Inn, founded in 1952, is often credited with creating the modern franchise system. Here's why this was revolutionary. Traditional hotel chains were corporate-owned. The parent company owned the buildings and employed all the staff. This required enormous capital and limited growth. The franchise model inverted this. The parent company developed the brand, standards, and operating systems. Individual franchisees invested their own capital to build and operate motels meeting those standards. The parent company collected franchise fees and royalties without having to invest in property or operations. This model solved multiple problems simultaneously. It allowed rapid expansion with minimal capital investment from the parent company. It created a network of owner-operators who were financially motivated to maintain standards because they owned their businesses. It spread risk across multiple independent operators instead of concentrating it in one corporation. And it created powerful brand recognition through ubiquity without requiring corporate ownership of hundreds of properties. The motel franchise model became the template for American commercial expansion. McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, 7-Eleven, and countless other franchises followed the pattern motels established. You could even argue that the motel industry invented modern American capitalism's preferred growth strategy, not through corporate expansion, but through standardization and franchising that aligned brand control with entrepreneurial motivation. The market segmentation innovation. Motels also pioneered modern market segmentation in hospitality. Before motels, hotels were largely undifferentiated beyond luxury versus budget. But motel chains began creating distinct brands targeting specific market segments. Holiday Inn for families, Ramada for business travelers, budget chains for price-conscious customers. Each brand had different amenities, price points, and design features aligned with their target market's specific needs and preferences. This segmentation wasn't about vague demographic categories. It was about understanding distinct use cases and designing products for them. Family travelers needed rooms with 2 beds, proximity to restaurants and attractions, pools for children. Business travelers needed reliable amenities for work, locations near business districts, quick checkout processes. Budget travelers needed basic cleanliness and functionality at the lowest possible price. By creating different brands for different segments, motel companies could serve all markets without diluting their positioning. This market segmentation strategy became standard across consumer industries. The idea that one company could serve multiple market segments through distinct brands, each with clear positioning and value propositions, was pioneered in the motel industry and then applied to automobiles, consumer goods, airlines, and virtually every mature consumer market. Part 2. The Cultural Transformation: How Motels Reshaped American Values. The democratization of travel and freedom. Before motels made highway travel accessible to middle-class families, vacation travel was largely reserved for the wealthy. If you couldn't afford expensive hotel rooms, you weren't traveling except out of necessity. The motel changed this fundamental equation. For the first time, ordinary American families could afford to travel for recreation. A week's vacation budget that once couldn't pay for 2 nights in a city hotel could now cover a week-long road trip. This democratization of travel wasn't just about economics. It fundamentally transformed American culture and self-conception. Travel became associated with freedom, with exploration, with family bonding, with discovering America. The road trip became a rite of passage, a formative experience that shaped American identity. And this was only possible because motels made it affordable. Think about what this meant psychologically and culturally. A factory worker in Detroit could pack his family into a car and drive to the Grand Canyon, staying in motels along the way. A middle-class family from New York could drive to Florida for vacation, seeing the country along the route. This wasn't just seeing America. It was experiencing mobility, autonomy, and possibility. The ability to go anywhere at any time, limited only by time and modest budgets, not by class or access to exclusive accommodation. The motel became the physical infrastructure that enabled American myths about freedom and mobility. The open road, the highway, the great American road trip, all these cultural phenomena required affordable accommodation to become reality. Without motels, these would have remained fantasies for the wealthy few. With motels, they became accessible experiences that defined American culture. The transformation of family structure and leisure. The motel phenomenon coincided with and enabled significant shifts in American family structure and leisure patterns. Post-war prosperity gave American families disposable income and paid vacation time. But what would they do with it? The motel provided an answer: the family road trip. This became a dominant form of family leisure that shaped generations. The family road trip, enabled by motels, created specific patterns of family interaction. Families spent extended time together in cars and motel rooms, away from the routines and social networks of home. This created both opportunity for bonding and potential for conflict. The cramped motel room became a pressure cooker for family dynamics. Parents and children negotiated space, fought over beds and bathrooms, dealt with each other's quirks in ways impossible during normal daily life at home. But this intensity was also where memories formed. Family stories, inside jokes, shared adventures all emerged from the peculiar intimacy of motel travel. The motel room became a temporary home, a neutral territory where family relationships were both tested and reinforced. This was different from staying with relatives or at resorts. The motel offered privacy and autonomy while forcing close proximity. It was domestic space without the permanence and routine of home. The motel also changed parenting. On the road, in motel rooms, parental authority was exercised differently. There were no separate children's rooms, no sending kids outside to play, no escape from each other's company. Parents had to negotiate different rules, different schedules, different levels of supervision. The motel experience taught both parents and children about adaptability, about making do, about finding entertainment and comfort in unfamiliar spaces. The architecture of privacy and anonymity. One of the most significant cultural impacts of motels was their contribution to American concepts of privacy and anonymity. The motel's exterior access design meant you could come and go without being seen by staff or other guests. You could bring whatever you wanted into your room. You could leave and return at any hour. This level of privacy and anonymity was unprecedented in commercial accommodation. This privacy had complex cultural implications. On one hand, it enabled legitimate desires for discretion. Families traveling with cranky children, people stopping for a few hours of sleep before continuing journeys, travelers who valued not having to interact with staff or other guests. The motel's privacy was liberating for anyone who didn't want their movements observed or their business known. But this same privacy also created space for activities that required discretion for less legitimate reasons. The motel became associated with affairs, with illicit encounters, with activities people wanted to keep hidden. This reputation, while exaggerated, reflected real aspects of motel culture. The privacy that made motels appealing for families also made them appealing for anyone seeking to avoid social surveillance. This dual nature created complex cultural associations. The motel could be wholesome family accommodation and site of transgression simultaneously. This ambiguity reflected broader American tensions about privacy, morality, and the relationship between public and private behavior. The motel's design forced Americans to confront questions about how much privacy was good, when anonymity enabled freedom versus when it enabled vice, and whether commercial spaces should facilitate or prevent private behavior. The rise of car culture and suburban values. Motels didn't just reflect automobile culture. They actively shaped it and were shaped by it in recursive feedback loops. The existence of motels made long-distance car travel more practical, which increased car ownership and highway travel, which created demand for more motels. This cycle transformed America from a railroad nation to an automobile nation, with profound implications for urban planning, economics, and culture. The motel embodied suburban values transposed onto commercial space. Suburban homes were horizontal, private, automobile-oriented. So were motels. Suburban life emphasized lawn space, parking, casual outdoor living. Motels had green spaces, parking lots, pools. Suburban culture valued privacy, informal social interaction, and separation of public and private life. So did motel culture. The motel was basically a temporary suburb for travelers. This alignment between motel design and suburban values wasn't coincidental. Both were products of post-war American affluence, automobile ownership, and cultural preferences for privacy and informality. The motel validated suburban values by extending them to commercial hospitality. If your suburban life was the ideal, then motels offered that ideal in temporary form. This cultural resonance made motels feel familiar and comfortable to suburban Americans, reinforcing their popularity. The transformation of regional identity and homogenization. The standardization that made motel chains economically successful also contributed to cultural homogenization. When every Holiday Inn room from Maine to California looked identical, regional differences diminished. You could travel across the country and never leave the standardized environment of chain motels, chain restaurants, chain gas stations. This created a kind of placelessness where everywhere felt like nowhere specific. This homogenization had both costs and benefits. The cost was loss of regional character, local distinctiveness, the sense that different places had different cultures. The chain motel room in Arizona looked like the one in Ohio, erasing geographic and cultural distance. Critics worried this homogenization was destroying American regional diversity, turning the country into one big suburb with identical commercial strips. But there were benefits too. Standardization reduced uncertainty, especially for travelers from different regions or backgrounds. An African-American family traveling through the segregated South could find refuge in a chain motel that, at least in theory, had to honor corporate policies against discrimination. A family from New York didn't have to guess whether a motel in Texas would meet their expectations of cleanliness and amenities. Standardization created predictability in an uncertain world. This tension between homogenization and accessibility reflects broader questions about American culture. Is diversity worth the cost of unpredictability? Is standardization cultural death or cultural democracy? The motel phenomenon didn't resolve these questions, but it forced Americans to confront them in concrete terms every time they chose a familiar chain motel over a local independent one. Part 3. The Psychology of Design, How Motel Architecture Shaped Behavior and Perception. The semiotics of neon signage. The neon sign wasn't just advertising for motels. It was a complete communication system designed for the specific challenges of highway travel. Understanding neon signage reveals sophisticated thinking about visual communication, brand identity, and consumer psychology that predates modern marketing theory. Consider the functional requirements. A driver moving at 50 or 60 miles per hour needs to process information quickly from a distance. The sign must be visible from hundreds of feet away. It must communicate essential information, availability, amenities, brand identity in seconds, and it must stand out among competing signs in an increasingly crowded visual landscape. Neon solved all these problems brilliantly. The brightness and color of neon made signs visible from extraordinary distances, even in bright sunlight. The ability to create custom shapes and lettering allowed creative differentiation while maintaining readability. The motion and animation possible with neon flickering effects, sequential lighting, chasing patterns, created eye-catching movement that drew attention. And the aesthetic qualities of neon, its retro-futuristic glow, its association with nightlife and urban excitement, created emotional resonance that went beyond mere information. But neon signage also created a specific visual language that communicated far more than words. The size of the sign indicated the quality and price level of the establishment. Massive towering signs suggested major chains with substantial investment. Modest signs indicated budget operations. The style of lettering communicated era and market positioning. Streamlined, modern fonts suggested modernity and sophistication. Western-themed lettering suggested adventure and authenticity. Script fonts suggested elegance or family-friendliness depending on execution. Color choices carried meaning beyond aesthetics. Red and white suggested American patriotism and family values. Blue and white suggested cleanliness and trustworthiness. Multicolor combinations suggested fun and affordability. The specific amenities highlighted on signs revealed target markets. A prominent swimming pool icon targeted families with children. A phone symbol targeted business travelers. Color TV and air conditioning announcements signaled modernity and comfort. The neon sign became such a powerful symbol that it transcended its functional purpose. The sign became the motel's identity, more recognizable and memorable than the building itself. People remembered the arrow sign at the Desert Inn or the starburst at the Stardust. The sign became architecture, contributing to the building's aesthetic impact and cultural meaning. When motels were demolished but signs were preserved, this revealed what really mattered about motel culture. The sign was the soul. The color psychology of interior design. The specific color choices in 1950s motel rooms weren't random aesthetic decisions. They reflected sophisticated understanding of color psychology, practical considerations about maintenance, and cultural associations that shaped guest perceptions and behaviors. Avocado greens, burnt oranges, and mustard yellows dominated motel interiors. These colors had specific functional advantages. They hid stains better than lighter colors, crucial for high-turnover commercial spaces. They didn't show wear as obviously as pure colors. They coordinated with a wide range of wood tones and materials used in furniture and fixtures. But beyond practicality, these colors communicated specific messages. Earthy tones suggested warmth, comfort, and natural authenticity. They connected motel spaces to the American landscape being traversed, particularly the warm tones of the Southwest that became synonymous with road trip aesthetics. These colors also represented modernity and progress in the 1950s context. They were new, different from the pastels and florals of previous decades. They suggested that motels were forward-looking, part of America's exciting future. The psychological impact of these colors on guest behavior was significant. Warm colors create feelings of energy and stimulation, appropriate for spaces where people stayed briefly before continuing journeys. They made small rooms feel cozier rather than cramped. They created visual interest that prevented rooms from feeling institutional or clinical. And they masked the reality that furnishings were inexpensive and standardized through visual distraction and pattern. The use of bold geometric patterns in bedspreads and curtains served similar psychological functions. Patterns created visual complexity that made spaces feel more designed and intentional. They hid wrinkles, stains, and wear better than solid colors. They provided visual stimulation that made generic rooms feel distinctive. And they expressed mid-century, modern design values about embracing abstraction, technology, and the future. The spatial psychology of room layout. Motel room layouts were designed with specific behavioral outcomes in mind. Every element's placement reflected understanding of how people move through and use temporary accommodation space. This spatial psychology created specific experiences that shaped how guests perceived motel stays. The bathroom placement near the entry served multiple purposes. It allowed family members to use facilities without disturbing sleeping guests. It created immediate reassurance about cleanliness, often the first concern when entering an unfamiliar room. It separated the semi-public functions of washing and toileting from the private sleeping area, and it provided a defined transition space between exterior and interior, outdoors and indoors. Bed placement maximized space efficiency while ensuring TV visibility from all sleeping positions. This wasn't about luxury. It was about understanding that the television was the primary entertainment and relaxation tool for motel guests, everything oriented toward making TV watching comfortable. Beds faced the TV directly. Side tables provided surfaces for drinks and snacks. Lighting allowed watching without glare. The entire room functioned as a theater designed for the small screen. The dressing area with mirror and counter space, often positioned between bathroom and sleeping area, created a functional zone for preparation and grooming. This spatial definition allowed multiple people to prepare for bed or departure simultaneously without conflict. It separated wet bathroom activities from dry bedroom activities, and it provided a psychological transition between public presentation and private rest. Storage design revealed interesting assumptions about guest behavior. Minimal closet space reflected reality that motel stays were brief and guests often didn't fully unpack. Drawer space in dressers was limited because belongings stayed in suitcases. But horizontal surfaces, dresser tops, nightstands, luggage racks, were generous because guests needed places to temporarily place items without putting them away. This design acknowledged that motel space was transitional, not residential. The relationship between interior and exterior space also shaped behavior. Large windows allowed surveillance of parked cars and the parking lot, providing security reassurance. Curtains heavy enough to provide complete privacy created a sense of protected space. The close proximity of the car outside the door allowed easy loading and unloading, but also created connection to the journey, preventing guests from fully settling in. The motel room was designed to feel temporary, a way station rather than a destination. The acoustic environment and sound design. Sound played a crucial role in motel experience, though it was rarely designed intentionally. The acoustic environment created by motel architecture shaped guest experiences in profound ways that reveal much about American culture and values. Thin walls that transmitted sound between rooms created accidental community. Guests heard neighbors' conversations, televisions, arguments, intimate moments. This acoustic transparency had contradictory effects. It violated the privacy that motel design promised. Guests who sought discretion found their activities audible to strangers, but it also created connection and shared experience. Hearing other families going through similar bedtime routines, similar travel frustrations, similar pleasures created unspoken bonds between strangers. The sounds of motel infrastructure became a soundscape that defined the experience. The rattling air conditioner provided white noise that masked other sounds while becoming an auditory texture that defined motel sleep. The humming ice machine down the hall, the periodic clunk of its operation, marked time and provided navigational audio landmarks. The sound of cars on the highway, never truly distant in a roadside motel, created constant reminder of motion and journey even during rest. Interior sounds had their own character. The particular creak of motel beds, springs that had supported thousands of previous guests, spoke of transience and shared experience. The dripping faucet or running toilet became acoustic signatures of individual rooms, quirks that made otherwise identical spaces distinctive. The television's particular audio quality, often tinny and distorted through cheap speakers, created a specific motel TV experience different from home viewing. This soundscape shaped behavior and perception. The omnipresent noise encouraged guests to create their own sound barriers, running TVs or air conditioners not for content or climate but for acoustic masking. The lack of true silence changed sleep patterns, requiring adjustment to environmental noise. The awareness that your sounds were audible to others shaped behavior, creating self-consciousness about noise levels and activities. The motel acoustic environment was democratic in that everyone experienced the same lack of privacy, creating equality through shared exposure. Part 4. The Decline and Transformation. Why classic motels failed and what replaced them. The interstate highway system and changing traffic patterns. The very infrastructure that enabled motel prosperity eventually contributed to their decline. The interstate highway system, begun in 1956, fundamentally changed American highway travel in ways that made classic roadside motels obsolete. Understanding this transformation reveals how infrastructure shapes commercial ecosystems. Old highway systems, the famous Route 66 and similar roads, went through towns. Travelers past businesses saw signs, could easily pull off for rest stops, meals, or lodging. This created ideal conditions for roadside businesses, but interstates bypassed towns deliberately. They were designed for efficient long-distance travel, not local commerce. This changed everything. Motels located on old highways suddenly found themselves off the main traffic flow. Travelers on interstates didn't see their signs. Exiting the interstate to stay at an old motel miles from the highway became inconvenient compared to staying at newer motels built directly at interstate exits. The old motel's competitive advantage, location on main traffic routes, evaporated overnight when traffic routes changed. This created massive disruption in the motel industry. Some motel owners relocated operations to interstate exits, abandoning investments in old locations. Others tried to survive on diminished traffic, cutting costs and deferring maintenance, beginning the cycle of decline that turned many classic motels into the deteriorating establishments that later became symbols of urban decay. Still others sold to new owners who changed properties to different uses, apartments, storage, or simply abandoned them. The motels that thrived in the interstate era were different from classic roadside motels. They were larger, with more rooms to justify prime interstate exit locations where land became expensive. They offered more amenities, restaurants, conference facilities, larger pools, to attract travelers who had more choices clustered at each exit. They were more standardized, part of national chains with reservation systems that let travelers book ahead rather than hunting for vacancies. The interstate motel was a different species than the roadside motel, evolved for a different environment. The rise of budget airlines and changing travel economics. Motel decline also reflected fundamental changes in long-distance travel economics. As airline travel became accessible to middle-class Americans in the 1960s and 1970s, the road trip lost its monopoly on affordable long-distance travel. This shift had cascading effects on motel demand and business models. For long-distance trips, flying became faster and increasingly competitive on cost when you factored in the time value of multi-day drives. A family driving from New York to California spent days on the road plus motel costs. Flying got them there in hours. As airfares declined through deregulation and competition, more travelers chose air over road for trips beyond a few hundred miles. This reduced demand for highway accommodation. The travelers who still drove were different from the family road trippers of the 1950s. They were more likely to be on short regional trips, business travelers covering territories, or budget-conscious travelers for whom flying wasn't economical. These different traveler segments had different needs and expectations. Business travelers wanted more amenities, better rooms, business services. Budget travelers wanted lower prices. Family road trippers, the core market for classic motels, were a shrinking segment. This market fragmentation pressured the one-size-fits-all classic motel model. To serve business travelers, motels needed to invest in upgraded amenities. To serve budget travelers, they needed to cut costs. To serve the declining family road trip market, they needed to maintain the classic model that was becoming economically unviable. Many motels tried to be all things to all markets and succeeded at none, falling into a no-man's land between budget and quality. The changing economics of real estate and development. Property economics shifted against classic motels in ways that made their business model unsustainable. Highway land that was cheap when motels were built became valuable as development spread outward from urban cores. This changed the calculation for motel owners and operators. A motel owner sitting on land that had become valuable for other development faced a decision: continue operating a motel with declining revenues and profits, or sell the land for development into higher value uses like retail, office space, or apartments. Increasingly, the math favored selling. This accelerated as returns on motel operation declined while land values increased. But selling created problems for the motel industry. The best located properties, those near growing urban areas or at prime interstate exits, were most attractive for alternative development and most likely to be sold and redeveloped. This left the motel industry concentrated in less desirable locations, further reducing competitiveness. The industry lost its best properties to other uses while being stuck with marginal locations. New motel development also faced different economics. Land costs at desirable interstate locations were higher. Construction costs increased. Travelers expected more amenities, driving up building and operating costs. To justify these higher costs, new motels needed to charge higher rates or achieve higher occupancy. This favored larger chains with brand recognition, reservation systems, and marketing capabilities. Independent motel operators found it increasingly difficult to compete, leading to industry consolidation and standardization. Quality decline and the reputation crisis. As economic pressures mounted, many motel owners cut costs by reducing maintenance, staffing, and amenity quality. This created a vicious cycle of decline that damaged the entire motel sector's reputation. Understanding this cycle reveals how quality degradation can destroy industries. Faced with declining revenues, motel owners deferred maintenance. They didn't replace worn carpets and bedspreads. They didn't repaint. They didn't upgrade fixtures. They cut housekeeping hours. They eliminated amenities like pools or restaurants. These cost cuts were individually rational responses to financial pressure, but they created deteriorating product quality that drove away customers, reducing revenues further. As more motels declined in quality, the motel category developed a reputation problem. Motels became associated with low quality, lack of cleanliness, safety concerns, and transient populations. This reputation damage affected even well-maintained motels. Travelers began avoiding motels categorically, preferring the predictability of chain hotels even at higher prices. The motel category was stigmatized. This reputation crisis was particularly severe because motels had no quality differentiation mechanism. Unlike hotels, which had star ratings and brand hierarchies that signaled quality levels, motels were largely undifferentiated in consumers' minds. A quality independent motel suffered from the reputation of low-quality motels in the same category. This made individual quality maintenance insufficient. The category's reputation pulled all motels down. Some motel chains attempted to combat this through rebranding. They dropped motel from names, calling themselves inns or hotels. They upgraded amenities and standards. They invested in marketing to differentiate from declining independence. But these efforts fought against powerful category associations. The motel identity became a liability that even quality operators struggled to overcome. The rise of limited-service hotels and market evolution. The hotel industry's response to motel decline was to create a new category, limited-service hotels, that combined the efficiency and affordability of motels with the quality and amenities of hotels. This evolution reveals how industries adapt to changing market needs. Limited-service hotels kept the motel innovations that worked, parking directly outside or near rooms, simplified service models with minimal staff, focus on sleeping rooms rather than extensive public spaces, but they added hotel elements that addressed motel weaknesses, interior corridors for security and climate control, consistent quality standards, brand reputations that signaled reliability, complimentary breakfast and other amenities that differentiated them from declining motels. This hybrid model proved successful. It gave travelers the convenience and price points they wanted from motels without the quality concerns and stigma. It allowed hotel chains to compete for the middle market between luxury hotels and budget motels, and it provided development economics that worked better than classic motel models, allowing profitability at higher price points that justified development costs. The success of limited-service hotels further pressured classic motels. They competed directly for the same customers, but with better reputations, amenities, and locations. Motels that had once dominated highway hospitality found themselves squeezed between budget hotels offering better quality at slightly higher prices and newer budget motel chains offering lower prices with minimal amenities. The middle ground where classic motels had thrived disappeared. This market evolution continued through subsequent decades with further segmentation. Extended-stay hotels targeted long-term travelers. Suite hotels offered apartment-like accommodations. Budget chains standardized minimal quality levels. Each new category addressed specific market needs more precisely than the general-purpose motel could, leaving motels with a shrinking market of travelers for whom nothing else worked. Part 5. The nostalgia industry and cultural legacy. Why we romanticize what we once avoided. The motel has undergone a remarkable cultural transformation from declining commercial reality to romanticized cultural icon. Understanding this nostalgia reveals how Americans process economic change, cultural loss, and anxieties about the present through selective memory of the past. People who actively avoided motels in the 1970s and 1980s, choosing hotels for quality and safety, now wax nostalgic about classic motels they never actually enjoyed staying in. This paradox isn't hypocrisy. It's how nostalgia works. We romanticize not the actual experience, but what that experience represented, a time when travel was adventure, when families took road trips, when America felt more open and optimistic. The motel becomes a symbol of values and experiences we believe we've lost, whether or not we actually experience them. The physical decay of classic motels contributes to their nostalgic appeal. Faded neon signs and peeling paint communicate age and authenticity in ways gleaming new facilities cannot. The visible passage of time creates patina that authenticates history. We value weathered motels precisely because they show their age, because they're survivors of different eras, because they haven't been updated to conform to contemporary expectations. Their very obsolescence makes them valuable as cultural artifacts. This nostalgia industry has commercial manifestations. Retro-styled hotels and motels that deliberately evoke 1950s aesthetics. Preservation efforts to save classic neon signs and motel architecture. Tourism based on visiting historic motels and highways. Books, films, and art celebrating motel culture. Each of these represents attempts to preserve or recreate experiences that exist primarily in imagination rather than memory. We're nostalgic for a motel experience, filtered through decades of cultural representation and selective memory. The motel nostalgia particularly appeals to Americans anxious about corporate homogenization and loss of regional character. The classic independent motel represents authenticity, local ownership, individual character, all things perceived as endangered by chain standardization. Never mind that motel chains pioneered the standardization we now deplore. The selective memory retains the independent highway motel as symbol of pre-corporate America, even though the reality was more complex. Preservation movements and historic designation. The preservation movement around classic motels reveals tension between cultural memory and economic reality. How do you preserve commercial buildings designed for obsolete business models? What do you preserve when the sign mattered more than the structure? These questions force confrontation with what historic preservation means in commercial architecture. Some preservation efforts focus on signs, preserving or relocating neon signs to museums or public displays. This acknowledges that signs were the most culturally significant aspect of motel architecture. But it also creates decontextualized artifacts, signs without their buildings, symbols without their functions. The sign preserved in a museum communicates different messages than the same sign operating on a highway, directing travelers to accommodation. Other preservation efforts attempt to maintain operating motels in historic form, but this faces severe economic challenges. Historic building codes make renovation expensive. Contemporary guests expect amenities incompatible with historic designs. Operating costs for small independent motels exceed revenues they can generate. Even successful historic motel preservation often requires subsidies, grants, or owners willing to accept below-market returns for cultural purposes. The most successful preservation combines adaptive reuse with cultural recognition. Convert the motel to apartments while preserving the sign and exterior. Use the structure for offices while maintaining architectural features. Create boutique hotels that offer contemporary amenities within restored mid-century design. These approaches preserve cultural and architectural heritage while creating economically viable uses. But they also acknowledge that pure preservation, maintaining motels exactly as they functioned in the 1950s, isn't economically possible. Historic designation for classic motels remains limited. Most motels don't meet criteria for National Register listing. They're too common, too standardized, too recent, too commercial. The bias in preservation toward residential and monumental architecture leaves most commercial vernacular architecture undervalued. This means classic motels disappear without record or recognition, lost to development or demolition. Only the most significant or unique receive protection. Modern lessons from motel history. What can contemporary businesses learn from motel history? The rise and fall of classic motels offers lessons about innovation, market evolution, and the life cycle of business models. First, innovation that solves real problems can rapidly transform industries. Motels succeeded because they genuinely solved problems traditional hotels couldn't address. They made travel affordable, convenient, and aligned with customer values. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was fundamental innovation that created new markets. Modern businesses should ask not just how to do existing things better, but what new things customers need that existing solutions don't provide. Second, standardization and franchise models create massive scalability, but also vulnerability. Motel chains grew rapidly by standardizing everything and allowing franchisees to replicate proven models. But this same standardization made the entire category vulnerable to quality decline when franchisees cut corners. The lesson is that scalability through standardization requires robust quality control and brand protection mechanisms, not just replication of physical templates. Third, infrastructure changes can rapidly obsolete successful business models. Motels thrived on old highways and declined when interstates shifted traffic. Modern businesses face similar infrastructure disruptions from internet, automation, and changing urban form. The lesson is to anticipate how infrastructure evolution might undermine current advantages and develop hedging strategies. Fourth, market segmentation evolves, and what was once a single market fractures into specialized niches. Motels tried to serve all highway travelers, but as the market specialized into business, budget, and family segments with different needs, the general-purpose motel became obsolete. Modern businesses must recognize when their markets are fragmenting and decide whether to specialize or create multiple brands for different segments. Fifth, reputation damage is easier than reputation repair. As motels declined, category reputation dragged even quality operators down. Rebuilding that reputation took decades and required effectively creating new categories with different names. The lesson is to protect quality standards aggressively, because reputation destruction happens quickly while reputation building is slow. Sixth, nostalgia can create value from obsolescence, but only after enough time has passed. The motel is valuable now as cultural artifact because enough time has passed for actual experience to be replaced by selective memory. Modern businesses might consider how to create legacy value from operations that become economically obsolete, preserving cultural significance even when commercial viability ends. Conclusion: the motel's enduring cultural imprint. The roadside motel's greatest legacy isn't commercial, it's cultural. The motel helped define American self-conception around mobility, freedom, and possibility. It made the road trip possible, and the road trip became central to American mythology. It expressed and shaped values about privacy, individualism, and the relationship between public and private space. It pioneered business models that spread across industries. It created design languages and aesthetic vocabularies that persist in American visual culture. Even though classic motels have largely disappeared from highways, replaced by limited-service hotels and interstate chains, their influence persists. Every time we value predictability in service through standardization, that's motel legacy. Every time we prefer privacy and convenience over social interaction and ceremony in commercial spaces, that's motel legacy. Every time families take road trips as bonding experiences, that's motel legacy. Every time neon aesthetics appear in art, design, or popular culture, that's motel legacy. The motel mattered not because the buildings were architecturally significant or the business model was perfect. The motel mattered because it aligned perfectly with a specific moment in American history when automobiles were becoming universal. Prosperity was expanding the middle class. Interstate highway systems were opening the country to exploration, and Americans were negotiating new understandings of privacy, mobility, and freedom. The motel was the physical infrastructure that made that moment possible, and in doing so, it helped create the America we still inhabit. Understanding the motel phenomenon means understanding how architecture, business innovation, and cultural values intersect to create institutions that shape society. The motel changed America not through grand vision or revolutionary ideology, but through pragmatic solutions to practical problems that happen to resonate with deep cultural needs. That's perhaps the most American thing about the motel. It was useful, it was accessible, it made money, and in being all these ordinary things, it became extraordinary. So the next time you pass a vintage motel sign, faded but still standing, or see a motel converted to apartments but retaining its characteristic architecture, pause for a moment. You're seeing not just a building but a piece of infrastructure that helped build modern America. You're seeing evidence of innovation that transformed industries. You're seeing artifacts of cultural values that still shape our lives. The motel may be history, but its legacy is present every time we travel, every time we value convenience and privacy, every time we believe the open road offers freedom and possibility. The motel helped make us who we are, and that makes it worth understanding, preserving, and remembering. Appendix Deep Dive: the franchise system innovation bonus analysis. The legal and financial structure of motel franchising. The franchise model that motels pioneered represented a revolutionary approach to business expansion that deserves deeper examination. The legal and financial innovations developed by motel chains became templates for American business expansion that persist today. Traditional expansion models required capital-intensive growth. A company wanting to expand had to purchase land, construct buildings, hire staff, and manage operations in each new location. This limited growth to the pace of capital accumulation and management capacity. The franchise model inverted this relationship through clever legal and financial engineering. Under franchise agreements, the parent company provided brand identity, operational systems, marketing, and quality standards. Franchisees provided capital investment, labor, local market knowledge, and day-to-day operations. The parent company's revenue came from franchise fees, ongoing royalties based on revenues, and sometimes required purchases of supplies or equipment. This created aligned incentives where both parties benefited from success, while distributing risk and capital requirements. Holiday Inn's franchise contract, developed in the 1950s, became the template. It specified exact construction standards, operational procedures, quality requirements, and reporting obligations. It granted exclusive territories to prevent franchisee competition. It provided training, marketing support, and reservation systems, and it included termination clauses that allowed the parent company to maintain quality standards by removing non-compliant franchisees. This legal framework solved multiple problems simultaneously. It allowed rapid expansion without massive capital requirements. It motivated franchisees through ownership while maintaining brand control. It created standardization through contractual requirements rather than corporate management. And it distributed risk across many independent operators rather than concentrating it in one company. The financial implications were profound. A motel chain could grow to hundreds of locations with minimal capital investment, using franchisee capital to finance expansion. This meant faster growth, lower risk, and higher returns on invested capital compared to company-owned expansion. The franchise model turned brand value into a sellable commodity, where the parent company's main asset was intellectual property and operational systems rather than physical facilities. The technology of reservation systems. One underappreciated innovation motel chains developed was centralized reservation systems that allowed travelers to book rooms in distant cities before arriving. This required technical infrastructure and organizational capabilities that were revolutionary for their time and prefigured modern information technology systems. Before reservation systems, travelers chose motels upon arrival. They drove until tired, looked for vacancy signs, and hoped for availability. This created inefficiency and anxiety. Travelers risked finding no rooms available. Motel owners faced demand uncertainty. The reservation system solved both problems through information technology, though the technology was primitive by modern standards. Early motel reservation systems used telephone networks and human operators. A central reservation center received calls from potential guests. Operators consulted lists showing availability at each motel in the chain. When a caller requested a reservation, the operator recorded it and contacted the specific motel to confirm. The motel recorded the reservation locally. This system required complex coordination, extensive telephone infrastructure, trained operators, and standardized procedures across locations. The operational complexity was substantial. Each motel had to communicate availability regularly to the central system. Reservations had to be confirmed and recorded reliably. No-shows and cancellations had to be handled. Overbooking had to be avoided. Payment and deposit procedures had to be standardized. All this coordination happened through manual processes and paper records, requiring discipline and consistency across hundreds of independent franchise locations. But the reservation system created enormous competitive advantages. Travelers could plan trips with confidence, knowing accommodation was secured. Business travelers could book from offices without uncertainty. This convenience attracted customers who might otherwise choose hotels or avoid chain motels. The reservation system became a service differentiator that justified slightly higher prices and created customer loyalty. The technical and organizational capabilities developed for motel reservation systems prefigured modern information technology. Centralized databases, network communications, standardized protocols, real-time information updates. All these concepts that became fundamental to digital commerce existed in analog form in motel reservation systems. When computer reservation systems emerged, motel chains were early adopters because they already understood the operational requirements and competitive advantages of reservation technology. The labor economics of motel operation. The motel business model created unique labor economics that reflected broader changes in American service work. Understanding motel labor patterns reveals how automation, standardization, and service reduction transformed employment. Traditional hotels were labor-intensive. They required doormen, bellhops, elevator operators, room service staff, restaurant workers, concierges, and extensive housekeeping. Labor costs were typically 50 to 60% of revenues. This made hotels expensive to operate and limited accessibility to travelers who could afford service-intensive hospitality. Motels eliminated most service positions through design and operational changes. No doormen or bellhops because guests carried their own luggage from cars to rooms. No elevator operators because there were no elevators. No room service because guests ate at separate restaurants. No concierge because travelers didn't need extensive local guidance. This elimination of service positions reduced labor costs to 20 to 30% of revenues, dramatically improving profit margins. The remaining labor positions were mainly housekeeping and front desk management. Housekeeping was standardized and routinized. Each room was cleaned according to identical procedures in fixed time periods. This allowed precise labor scheduling and productivity measurement. Housekeepers became interchangeable workers performing identical tasks, not skilled craftspeople with specialized knowledge. This de-skilling of labor reduced wages and increased management control. Front desk operation was typically handled by a live-in manager rather than shifts of employees. The manager answered phones, checked in guests, handled maintenance, and provided minimal oversight. This concentration of functions in one person reduced labor costs while aligning incentives through ownership or management contracts tied to profitability. The manager was often the owner or franchise operator, eliminating the principal agent problem that plagued traditional hotels where employees had different interests than ownership. This labor model had complex implications. It reduced costs and enabled affordability that democratized travel, but it also reduced employment quality, eliminating skilled service positions and replacing them with lower-wage, lower-skilled jobs. The motel labor model became a template for service sector employment more broadly. Standardization, routinization, elimination of skilled positions, replacement of employees with customers doing their own service work, like carrying luggage. These patterns spread across retail, food service, and hospitality. The motel proved that service reduction could be market success if aligned with customer values. Travelers valued low prices and convenience more than elaborate service. This lesson influenced service industries broadly. Why employ expensive service workers when customers prefer self-service at lower prices? The motel helped establish the dominance of the low-price, self-service model that characterizes much American commerce. The environmental and urban planning legacy. Motels contributed to urban and environmental patterns that shaped American development for decades. Understanding these impacts reveals how commercial architecture influences broader land use and environmental outcomes. Motel development favored horizontal sprawl over vertical density. This reflected highway location, cheap land economics, and parking requirements. But it also created development patterns that consumed more land, encouraged automobile dependence, and fragmented landscapes. The motel strip, with its linear development along highways, became a dominant American landscape pattern that persists in commercial corridors across the country. This development pattern had environmental consequences. More impervious surface from extensive parking lots increased stormwater runoff. Automobile-oriented design discouraged walking or transit use, increasing vehicle miles traveled and emissions. Linear sprawl consumed agricultural and natural land for commercial development. The motel's environmental footprint per guest was substantially larger than dense urban hotels serving similar functions. But motels also influenced zoning and land use regulation in ways that persist today. Many jurisdictions developed specific zoning categories for motels, recognizing they didn't fit traditional residential or commercial zones. Parking requirements emerged partly from motel development patterns, establishing minimum parking ratios that then spread to all commercial development. Setback requirements and landscape standards reflected motel aesthetics and site designs. The motel helped create the regulatory framework for automobile-oriented commercial development. The motel strip became the template for highway commercial development. Gas stations, restaurants, car dealerships, retail stores all located along highways in patterns pioneered by motels. This created redundancy and inefficiency, with commercial development sprawling along miles of highway rather than concentrating in compact nodes. But it also created accessibility and visibility for commercial uses, allowing small businesses to compete through highway frontage rather than expensive downtown locations. Urban planners and critics attacked motel strips as ugly, inefficient, and environmentally destructive. This criticism had merit, but it also missed how motel development patterns reflected genuine economic and social preferences. People valued automobile access, free parking, and commercial convenience more than aesthetic concerns or environmental impacts. Trying to prevent motel pattern development without addressing underlying preferences proved ineffective, as commercial sprawl continued despite planning efforts to contain it. Modern sustainability and smart growth movements partially react against development patterns motels exemplified. Efforts to create walkable, mixed-use, transit-oriented development represent rejection of automobile-oriented sprawl. But these efforts face the reality that automobile-oriented patterns became embedded in American life partly because they offered genuine advantages of convenience, affordability, and accessibility that people valued. Changing these patterns requires not just regulation, but shifting the economic and cultural foundations that made them attractive. Conclusion: understanding infrastructure through cultural artifacts. The motel teaches us to see commercial architecture as cultural infrastructure worthy of serious analysis. These weren't just businesses providing overnight accommodation. They were physical manifestations of cultural values, economic innovations, technological capabilities, and social patterns that define their era. Understanding them requires looking beyond nostalgia and aesthetics to examine the complex systems, business models, behavioral patterns, and cultural meanings they embodied. Every aspect of motel design, from neon signs to room layouts to franchise contracts, reflected and shaped American society. The choices motel builders made about architecture, business organization, and service delivery weren't random. They were responses to specific economic conditions, cultural values, technological capabilities, and customer expectations. Analyzing these choices reveals how commerce, culture, and built environment interact to create the landscapes we inhabit. The motel's rise showed how innovation that aligns product delivery with customer values and economic realities can transform industries. The motel's decline showed how infrastructure changes, market evolution, and quality degradation can obsolete successful models. The motel's preservation and cultural persistence shows how commercial vernacular architecture becomes heritage worthy of protection and analysis. Together, these patterns offer lessons about innovation, competition, market evolution, and cultural change that extend far beyond hospitality industry history. Most importantly, the motel reminds us that understanding the present requires examining how we got here. The landscapes we inhabit, the business models that structure commerce, the cultural values that shape preferences, all bear traces of innovations and experiments from previous eras. The motel strip may seem ubiquitous and eternal, but it was created by specific choices in specific historical moments. Understanding those choices helps us understand our present options and constraints. We inherit landscapes and systems created by previous generations responding to their circumstances. Changing our inheritance requires understanding how it was created and why. The roadside motel gave us innovation in franchise systems now used across industries, design patterns that influenced commercial architecture broadly, business models that democratized services previously restricted to elites, cultural spaces that shaped American identity and values, labor patterns that became templates for service work, environmental and planning impacts that persist in our landscapes. This comprehensive influence makes the motel worthy of serious study, not as nostalgia object, but as window into how commercial innovation shapes society. So when analyzing any commercial phenomenon, use the motel as template for comprehensive examination. Look at business models and economic incentives. Examine design choices and their behavioral implications. Consider cultural meanings and value expressions. Understand labor implications and social impacts. Trace environmental and planning consequences. Connect commercial innovation to broader patterns of social change. This holistic analysis reveals how business, culture, and built environment interact in ways that shape our daily lives and collective futures. The motel story is ultimately about how ordinary commercial decisions accumulate into extraordinary cultural transformation. No one planned for motels to reshape American mobility, democratize travel, or influence business practices across industries. These outcomes emerged from thousands of individual decisions by motel builders, operators, and travelers pursuing their interests within specific constraints. Understanding this emergence helps us see how innovation happens, how culture changes, and how commercial choices become infrastructure that constrains and enables future possibilities. That's the ultimate lesson of motel history. Small innovations solving immediate problems can scale into systems that transform societies. Business models created for specific markets can template entire economic sectors. Design choices reflecting contemporary values can shape landscapes for generations. The ordinary becomes extraordinary through replication, adaptation, and cultural integration. And understanding this process helps us recognize innovation potential in our present and imagine transformation possibilities for our future.